All right, we're here with James DiEugenio. He's the author of the JFK assassination, the evidence today, and he is also the editor and publisher of kennediesandking.com. He's just published two new reviews of two television specials that came out. The first was on CNN called American Dynasties, The Kennedys, and the article is called CNN Disservices History, and you can find that on Kennedies and King. And he also wrote a review of Tom Hanks's 1968, the year that changed America. So there's also a review there. I definitely suggest people read these, and if you have family members who watch these, you can send them to them for a second thought on these shows. But thank you, Jim, for talking to us today.
Sure.
We'll start with the American Dynasties one. That was on CNN.
All right. These two documentaries, the first one was a six-parter called American Dynasties, The Kennedys. That was on CNN. The second one was 1968, the year that changed America. That was also on CNN, which, see, this is kind of disturbing in and of itself because, see, CNN is supposed to be the moderate channel of the three major cable channels. Fox is on the right, MSNBC is on the left, and CNN is supposed to be in the middle, which is really disturbing if these two shows are examples of moderation today. Because in my view, there's no way in the world that either of these programs is done from a center or moderate point of view. I think they, as we're going to see, they're both, especially American Dynasties, is a very kind of agenda-driven, completely controlled presentation. Okay, and in my article on this, which is at Kennedies and King, all right, you will see that from the very beginning, from the very choice of talking heads, the show is completely tilted. All right, people like Randy Taraborelli, who is nothing but an entertainment journalist, Larry Ty, who wrote a book about Bobby Kennedy that was endorsed by what I call the post-war champion of genocides, Henry Kissinger.
Mm.
All right. Van Jones. I mean, what has Van Jones ever written about the Kennedys? I mean, Van Jones wrote a good book called The Green Dollar Economy. What that has to do with the Kennedys is something I don't understand. All right. Okay. But I began to see what this show was really about midway through the second part, because when I was writing for the paper magazine Probe, I had done what has become kind of a famous article, all right, which was called The Posthumous Assassination of John F. Kennedy. All right. That article got one of the most lively responses ever from when I was doing Probe. I think I published that in 97 or 98. In that series, it was a two-part series. I essentially went through what had caused the publication of Seymour Hersh's piece of junk book, The Dark Side of Camelot. All right. And I traced where this all started. And there was a series of what I call negative biographies that were published after the Church Committee had been completed, which I think was 75 or 76. And I went through all these books, and they were by authors like John Davis, late John Davis, the late Clay Blair, David Horowitz and Peter Collier, Thomas Reeves, etc. And they all came from the same imprint. okay, which was pretty easy to deduce after you read one or two of them. All right. The whole idea was to counteract the first wave of books about the Kennedys. If you recall, after JFK was assassinated, there was a series of, I'd say, about 4 books that came out from people who knew him pretty well. And these books did not just deal with JFK, they dealt with other members of his family, like Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. And so, if you recall, these were like 1,000 Days by Arthur Schlesinger, which is a very good book. All right. Um, there was also Ted Sorens's book, Kennedy. And there was also Johnny We Hardly Knew Ye by O'Donnell and Powers. And then there was also With Kennedy by Pierre Salinger. All right. And those are pretty good books, by the way. Those books stand up very well today, you know, especially when you compare them to later books that were published in the 90s and in the new millennium. Works by authors like Philip Muhlenbeck and Robert Rakove. All right. Those very good books. These were meant to counteract them and to essentially be smear jobs. All right. And I began to see the paradigm that was set by them. And these were that we have to make Joe Kennedy, the father of all the Kennedy children, into some kind of a rough caricature who had just tremendous influence over his children, and the kids were essentially empty vessels of this bad guy, okay, which is completely wrong, all right? And as this is one of the things I addressed in that essay, all right? For example, Joe Kennedy was an isolationist. That's what got him into trouble when he became ambassador to England.
Right.
All right. Okay, well, from the first couple of years that JFK was in the House of Representatives, it was very clear he was an internationalist. Okay, he was, and this went on and on and on until he became senator and president, that he felt that the United States had a definite role to play in the foreign policy field. Okay, it differed from what the Dulles brothers and Dean Acheson thought, but there's no doubt that JFK was an internationalist. Okay, and also Congressman Kennedy voted to sustain Harry Truman's veto of the Taft-Hartley bill. All right, Taft-Hartley bill was very strongly anti-union. All right, but JFK didn't go along with that, and of course, that did not sit very well with his father, but he did it anyway. All right. It also just the Kennedy's American Dynasty also says that Joe Kennedy actually wanted to be president. Well, in Richard Whalen's book, it's 472 pages. All right. And it's not very, Whalen was not a completely negative biographer, but he was not a very sympathetic biographer either. All right. He labeled these as nothing but, quote, the echo of the press talking to itself. In other words, they were amplified rumors. Joe Kennedy knew that he was not going to be president. All right. But then what these books try and do is say that somehow he then anointed his son, John Kennedy, and he said, you must go in the political office, and you must go ahead and go to the highest position. Well, this is all counteracted, by, if you read, for example, the O'Donnell and Powers book, okay, you will see that JFK actually at the beginning of after he got out of the service, he was actually a reporter. He had been a published author while England slept. And that's the first thing he seriously thought of doing. He thought of carving out a career in journalism and authoring books. Since his first book had been a pretty big success, And so He then changed his mind after he had done a couple of reporting jobs in San Francisco at the UN and at the meeting at Potsdam in Europe. And he felt that he could do a better job influencing events if he was in the arena rather than just reporting on it. The guy was a political junkie from the beginning. As John Shaw says in his book, JFK and the Senate, you know, young John Kennedy subscribed to the New York Times at age 14. All right. Okay, so, he had been very interested in this stuff for a long period of time. All right. And so he actually, the other thing that actually influenced him on this was his experience in World War II.
Oh, before we
Was,
let me, I mean, he had an older brother, right? And wasn't that sort of the
yes,
favorite
Joe
of
Kennedy,
right?
who died in Europe, okay, in the war on a bombing mission. Okay. And so what a lot of people believe is that Joe was actually going to be the guy who was going to lead the Kennedy dynasty into the political world. All right. And then the myth has it that after Joe perished, his father called him in and said, now that your brother is dead, it has to be you. None of that is true. Okay. None of that is true. All right. See, JFK, if you read about him, because he was such a sickly child, okay, he did a lot of reading. All right, he was very curious. He was very bright. All right, and that profile, of course, would fit into being a writer and an author. Okay, and so that's at first what he wanted to do. But after the war, he decided, that we should never let something like that happen again. All right, and so that was the other thing that influenced him to go into politics. All right. Now, this American Dynasties, to put it mildly, this lackluster exercise, then tries and goes ahead and it smears JFK's service on PT 109. They cut from Richard Mahoney to David Nassau, and this is obviously done very planned, in advance. And they said somehow JFK didn't make a big deal about his medals, and that Nassau actually says that Kennedy should have been court-martialed for what he did with PT 109 since he was out of his area. I mean, this is what a bunch of baloney this is. Look, the whole PT 109 episode has been misconstrued by so many writers, it's kind of ridiculous. See, that mission in August of 1943, PT 109, the torpedo boat, was part of at least a 9-boat platoon that was meant to try and draw these Japanese destroyers out of port and then pick them off as they came. What went on here was that the mission was so badly designed, all right, number one, and that the platoon leader provoked a response and then left, JFK's platoon leader, then left with the only radar set that they had. So Kennedy's ship was caught in the dead of night, completely pitch black, with no radar, not knowing who was in the vicinity. And then when they started being attacked, they thought it was from shore batteries. That's how blind they were. But Kennedy didn't want to turn on the lights because, of course, that would tell the enemy where he was. All right? So because the thing was bungled so badly, the remaining PT boats became objects of attack instead of being attackers. All right? And so Kennedy's ship was deliberately rammed by a Japanese destroyer. cutting the boat in half. And Kennedy now had to try and do his best to save what was left of his command. Two guys were killed upon impact. Kennedy managed to position some of them on the floating hulk of the debris of the ship. Some of these guys couldn't swim. All right. And so he then got them grouped together on some of the timber that was floating in the ocean, and he led them away swimming with a lifeboat strap between his teeth, towing a badly burned sailor behind him. If you can believe this, he did that for 4 hours, all right, until they reached Plum Pudding Island. But Plum Pudding Island didn't have water or fruit on it. So then Kennedy had to scout to another nearby island. He swam again 2.5 miles to Olasana Island. There he found some vegetation and water, and he transferred the crew to that island. He then scratched out a message on a coconut shell, and he gave it to some native Allied scouts in canoes. And then they managed to get it to their British scoutmaster, and 6 days later, with the crew very much in bad health, a large canoe arrived with food that rescued them. So what this show says is completely bogus. You know, the people who should have been court-martialed are the people who planned the operation and then left with leaving him with no radar. All right, and unlike what the program says, Kennedy was proud of his military service, as he should have been. He kept his 3 medals, and he kept a coconut shell on his presidential desk. This is nothing but a hatchet job. Their treatment of that whole episode is a deliberate hatchet job, the worst tradition of TV journalism. All right. So then we go to the House of Representatives, Kennedy's service there, which the program pretty much just floats over. All right. Kennedy was very progressive as a congressman. His issues were national health care. Remember, this is back in 1946. All right. Advocacy of workers' rights to organize, housing for returning veterans, and securing the future of the United Nations as a hope for peace in the world. All right. One of the things he concentrated on was housing for returning veterans. He strongly criticized the Republican stance on this issue. Or he actually once said that their allies, the American Legion, had not had a constructive thought about American progress since 1918. Now, that would be a good quote to put on TV, wouldn't it? Not on there. All right. He actually debated Richard Nixon in McKeesport, Pennsylvania in 1947. Nixon, of course, was for Taft-Hartley, the union-busting bill. All right. JFK was against it. All right. That's not in the program either. The show then runs to the Senate. Evan Thomas, who used to work for Newsweek, has now become pretty much a hack, all right, intones at this time that John Kennedy considered RFK something like a pain in the butt at this time, before he's about to become his campaign manager. That's because the show leaves out the trip that they made to the Far East and Indochina in 1951, all right? This was done in order for JFK to get a higher profile in foreign policy in order to run against Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts for the Senate seat. On that trip, Kennedy met Edmund Gullion, a guy he had known very briefly in Washington. Edmund Gullion was a counsel in the State Department who was working at that time in Indochina because he spoke fluent French. He was actually stationed in Saigon. They also met with Nehru of India, and both men gave them the same message, that there is no way France is going to retake Vietnam. Okay, it's a hopeless cause. That had a tremendous impact on JFK's thinking at the time. All right. In fact, it changed his whole view of foreign policy. All right. Now, Bobby Kennedy, of course, runs the 1952 Senate campaign, and it is not at the request of Joe Kennedy, as the show says. It was done through Kenny O'Donnell. O'Donnell pretty much told Bobby Kennedy that unless he took over, there was a real possibility JFK was going to lose. So Bobby became the campaign manager, did a very good job, worked 18-hour days, showed excellent organizational ability. All right. The next part of the show is so bizarre. This is what I mean about being a hatchet job. It's so bizarre, it's so misconceived that it gives away the game. See, what they do here, they don't deal very much at all with JFK's career in the Senate, all right, which was about 8 years. What they concentrate on is Bobby Kennedy as chief counsel, rather, not chief counsel, his service on the McCarthy committee, and then what became the Rackets committee under McClellan, right? And he then became chief counsel as that committee passed from McCarthy to McClellan. And it tries to say, I really couldn't believe they said this, that somehow Senator Kennedy had a kind of nondescript career in the Senate, and that the only highlight of it was when he served on the McClellan committee. That is, when Bobby Kennedy went after Jimmy Hoffa and the mob. I mean, I really couldn't believe this. This was really ridiculous. But this is how agenda-driven this show is. John Shaw wrote what I think is the only book about JFK's career in the Senate. Okay? And I think it's actually called that, JFK in the Senate. In his book, he goes through many of the distinguished things that Senator Kennedy did there on both the domestic side, the regional side for the economy of Massachusetts, okay, the St. Lawrence Seaway, things like that. His advocacy for workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and those kind of very good domestic programs. But he concludes that the real achievement of what JFK did in the Senate is that the formulation of Kennedy's challenge to the reigning foreign policy orthodoxy that governed both parties, that was his signal achievement. This show doesn't want to say that. All right? The Republican Cold War militancy towards Russia and that influence in the Third World was led by Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, and the Dulles brothers, John Foster at State and Allen at the CIA. In the Senate, Lyndon Johnson and the Southern Democrats offered no real alternative to this. They were at best a pale shadow of that policy, right? And as Shaw notes, with an old joke, the Senate was the only place in the country where the South did not lose a civil war. That's how much in control those Southern senators were. Kennedy continued his crusade from his meeting with Edmund Gullion, trying to create an alternative to this militant policy by trying to point out that the real problem in the Third World wasn't communism. It was colonialism and the counterforce that it created, which was a simmering, sometimes boiling over nationalism. Kennedy thought that the United States should foster and mold that nationalism, even if it meant conflicting with our European allies. What makes the program's avoidance of this key issue so bizarre is that one of the talking heads is Richard Mahoney. Mahoney is the author of one of the best books on this subject, JFK Ordeal in Africa. And I don't for 5 seconds believe that the producers of this show weren't aware of that book. They clearly wanted to ignore it and not let Mahoney talk about all the descriptions of Kennedy's opposition to Eisenhower and Nixon in that regard. Right? So, for instance, there's no mention of Kennedy's opposition to Operation Vulture. Operation Vulture was the scheme by John Foster Dulles to use atomic weapons to bail out the siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So Kennedy was against that. He spoke up against it on the floor of the Senate. There's nothing about Adlai Stevenson's telegram to stifle Kennedy's radical foreign policy statements during the 1956 presidential race. I couldn't believe this. There's not even one mention of Kennedy's milestone speech in the summer of 1957 against the Dulles-Eisenhower attempt to help France salvage another remnant of its overseas empire, this time in Algeria. Kennedy showed a lot of courage in making that speech because he was criticizing a longtime American ally, namely France. All right? That speech, in addition to being opposed by Eisenhower, Nixon, and the Dulles brothers, it was criticized by literally scores of media outlets. And also members of his own party, like Stevenson and Atchison. All right? Kennedy was really hammered on that speech, and he really thought he had made a mistake, but his father told him, don't worry. 2 years from now, you're going to look like a prophet because it's going to get worse before it gets better, which is exactly what happened. All right? As the French dilemma in Algeria got worse and worse, people began to think back to Kennedy's speech and said, hey, maybe this guy knew what the heck he was talking about. And so Kennedy, because of that speech, became the unofficial emissary to visiting dignitaries from Africa. He was the only guy in the Senate who had any interest in that continent at all. And he was the only guy in the Senate who that early spoke against the whole Algerian civil war that Nixon and Eisenhower allied against. And he's the one who made the comparison when he said, didn't we learn 3 years ago when the French fell at Dien Bien Phu that this is the wrong policy to be supporting them on? If we were really their friends, we'd be guiding them to the negotiating table so they can make a graceful exit rather than trying to hang on to this last outpost of empire. There is not one single sentence in this entire show about this issue. Now, David, I ask you, do you really think they missed it?
No, I mean, you make a good point that they have in several spots in here that they had the people, talking who wrote on some of these specific issues, but they just sort of leave out, they sort of pick and choose, even though they have some of these people, they don't have them talk about some of these major things that they looked at. So it's interesting to see what they pick and choose from, even though they obviously were aware of these things. I'm sure Richard Mahoney, when he was, I don't know how they set these up, but I'm sure he had his chance to say, I'd like to talk about this and this and this, and this was important and that was important, and they probably conducted God knows how many hours of interviews with him, and then they just picked, this little bit and that little bit. So, when we're done with this section, I'd like to get a little more into why you think they do this and that. But let's keep going. I do want to ask. I think you're about to get to the presidential election 1960, but just so we can get a timeline, starting from the end of World War II until 1960, just what were the years of, his stint in the House of Representatives and then his stint in the Senate?
Kennedy was in the House from 46 to 52. He was in the Senate from 52 to 1960. And this is when now the show leads into the race for the presidency between Nixon and Kennedy. All right, it's pretty standard stuff. It's very superficial. But Tim Neftali gets in there and says somehow that the choice of Lyndon Johnson as VP was Joe Kennedy's. All right, again, this is another attempt to somehow show the influence of Joe Kennedy on the lives of the Kennedy children. The big problem with this is simply not true. The two best books that deal with this subject are 1,000 Days by Arthur Schlesinger and Kennedy by Ted Sorensen. The two guys who were so strongly pushing Johnson on Kennedy were Phil Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist Joseph Alsop. You know, really Graham even more than Alsop. That's how this happened. All right. The what now at this point, of course, this was a very good opportunity for the program to show how this was one of the milestones that created a very strong antagonism between LBJ and Bobby Kennedy. You know, it doesn't do that. There's a whole book about this by Jeff Shesol called Mutual Contempt. And it spends a lot of time on this particular dispute between JFK and RFK, okay, on Lyndon Johnson. All right. And I don't think the show makes enough of that because in historical terms, which this is supposed to be about, this is a very important incident. All right. And it doesn't make enough of that. Larry Ty, who did a very bad biography of RFK, now says that Bobby Kennedy was appointed Attorney General, and he was the least prepared Attorney General in history. Really. Herbert Brownell, Eisenhower's Attorney General, was, get this, a state assemblyman for 4 years. He was then chairman of the Republican National Committee for 2 years. The rest of his life, his career, he was a corporate lawyer. How does that prepare you for becoming Attorney General? Homer Cummings, who served under FDR, was the mayor of Stamford, Connecticut, which at that time had a population of 50,000. He was then a state attorney in Fairfield, Connecticut, population 20,000. All right. Bobby Kennedy had served in Washington as a criminal investigator in the Justice Department and then a congressional counsel for 10 years prior to becoming Attorney General. He had faced off and pursued some of the most deadly killers and organized crime members in America, including Sam Giancana. His pursuit of the mob in the Senate was unprecedented in American crime annals. His attempt to clean up corrupt labor unions was also unique. You know, you could very much argue, I believe, that it was Bobby Kennedy who revolutionized the position of chief counsel and the use of investigative techniques on Capitol Hill. See, these things that before Bobby Kennedy, they were essentially debating societies. You know, it was Bobby Kennedy who was one of the real pioneers in doing real investigations on Capitol Hill. Now, I'm not going to say he was the first, and I'm not going to say he was the only one, okay? But he was one of the pioneers in that field who then made it kind of standard to have, you know, accountants, detectives, investigators on your staff, all right? I mean, what really could you ask more in an attorney general? I don't think very much more. But this is part of the whole idea to somehow say that Bobby Kennedy's and JFK's first year in the White House was not very successful. And so, of course, if you only concentrate on the Bay of Pigs and perhaps the construction of the Berlin Wall, you know, then you can look at it that way. See, but because they ignored what JFK was doing in the Senate those 8 years, formulating this alternative foreign policy, they ignored the things that JFK was trying to do once he went into the White House. So therefore, they don't talk about things like the Congo, how Kennedy was trying to keep that state alive after Lumumba's assassination. They don't talk about his friendship with Sukarno in Indonesia. They ignore how much Kennedy admired that best-selling book, The Ugly American, all right, which summarized his attitude towards the American State Department in the Third World. He actually bought 100 copies of that book, and he gave it to all the other senators. He then helped get the film made. All right? So what he was doing here, in addition to Congo and Indonesia, he was also changing American foreign policy in the Middle East. he was doing an outreach to Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, okay? Because John Foster Dulles had burned that relationship because Nasser recognized China and refused to join the Baghdad Pact, all right? And then because of that, Foster Dulles withdrew the funding for the Aswan Dam, and that gave Moscow an opportunity to fill that breach, which they did. Kennedy thought that was very ill-advised for three reasons. Generally speaking, he thought we could compete with the Russians in the Third World by peaceful means, that is, befriending and aiding non-aligned neutral leaders. Second, Nasser was an articulate, charismatic leader who had a very wide influence in the Middle East. I mean, he was really the only guy like that, if you ask me. Third, he was a secularist, a socialist, and a progressive who directly opposed the Islamic fundamentalists, which was a force in that area that Kennedy feared as far back as his speech in 1957. In fact, Nasser had members of the Muslim Brotherhood prosecuted, imprisoned, and executed. In my article here, I linked to a video on YouTube about Nasser addressing that issue, his opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood. That was really the underground organization that was trying to spread Islamic fundamentalism throughout the Middle East. And that group was financed by the British.
Right.
Okay? Because the British felt that it would be easier to deal with monarchies, religious monarchies, in their representation of BP, the giant petroleum company, than it would be somebody like Nasser or Mossadegh who would drive for better deals for the Arab people. All right?
Sure. And look at where we are today with that.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Wouldn't that have been a very contemporary issue for this show to deal with about American policy in the Third World and all the powerful overtones that conflict had with the growth of Al-Qaeda? But of course, by now it's pretty obvious that these people didn't want this new information on there. No matter how interesting, no matter how enlightening. All right? So what they do is they talk about the Bay of Pigs, the failure at the Bay of Pigs, but they don't review what happened afterwards. That is the appointment of the Taylor Commission and JFK's appointment of Bobby Kennedy to be on that commission, and how Bobby Kennedy went after Allen Dulles when he was on the witness stand, asked him some very difficult questions which Dulles really couldn't answer. Then he consulted with Bob Lovett, the former Secretary of Defense, through his father, Joe Kennedy, and found out that both Lovett and David Bruce had tried to get Dulles fired. All right? When JFK was alerted to all this and talked to Lovett, he decided to decapitate the top level of the CIA, Allen Dulles, Dick Bissell, and Charles Cabell. There isn't one word in this documentary about that. Not one word. All right? Okay, so then we go to the space missions. And this is depicted as a win-at-all-costs ambition instilled in his children by Joe Kennedy. This is just silly. And again, what the show does, it ignores the input of one of their own commentators, Tim Naftali. In his book, One Hell of a Gamble, he wrote that in May of 1961, JFK really didn't want to promote the space race, the Cold War and space race. All right? He thought it would be a good idea to propose a co-sponsored mission. Kennedy originally thought the whole space mission was way too expensive. And only when the Russians refused a joint proposal, because they were ahead at that time by Dean Rusk, did Kennedy then commit to Apollo. And even then, he tried for a joint mission to the moon. So obviously, if this was supposed to be an exhibition of a win at all costs attitude, well, why do you try and launch a joint mission if you're trying to win at all costs? And the answer is he wasn't. But they don't want to tell you that. Mm. One of the most shocking things about this series is that there isn't one mention of Vietnam during the whole discussion of President Kennedy's tenure. Not one.
Wow.
And when they do bring up the subject later, during Bobby Kennedy's presidential campaign, Evan Thomas, the hack, gets both clauses of his sentence wrong. He says that somehow Bobby felt badly about the early decision to send American troops into Indochina. All right. First of all, there were no American troops in Indochina from 1961 to 1963. There were no more combat troops in Vietnam on the day Kennedy was killed than on the day he came into office, meaning none. All right. Secondly, in other words, there were only advisors. Secondly, there isn't any trace of Bobby Kennedy being involved in those early discussions on what to do about the American commitment into Indochina. I mean, there's two very good discussions of this issue by John Newman in JFK and Vietnam and James Blight in Virtual JFK. I couldn't find any trace of Bobby Kennedy being in the room when JFK overruled his advisors, saying we're not sending combat troops in. We're only going to go ahead and increase the number of advisors that we send there. So I don't know what the heck Evan Thomas is talking about here, really. All right. I mean, let's put it this way. When your program comes up and pales in comparison with Chris Matthews in his recent biography of Bobby Kennedy, he quotes RFK saying in 1967 that his brother would have never sent combat troops into Indochina because then it would become America's war. And as John Bohr wrote in his much better book, The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy was advising Johnson as early as 1964 not to militarize Indochina. All right. See, this reveals right then and there, of course, that there was a split between Johnson and JFK on Vietnam and that RFK knew about it. Well, they don't want to delve into that whole issue. All right. That's where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. Let me just go through a few more of the, instead of going into in-depth in these issues, let me just highlight some of the other failures of this terrible program. All right. What has become a right-wing paradigm in the field is echoed by Evan Thomas and Van Jones, who both say that the Kennedys were not really interested in civil rights when they entered the White House. This is completely wrong, and is contradicted by the record. As journalist Harry Golden wrote back in 1964, John Kennedy was an advocate of a strong civil rights bill back in 1957. He thought the bill proposed by Lyndon Johnson, who was the majority leader at the time, was a little bit too weak, but he voted for it anyway. All right. Kennedy said the same to an audience when he spoke about the issue in, of all places, Jackson, Mississippi, which was in 1957. As Golden writes in his book, those two incidents started the decline in JFK's popularity in the South, but he was not going to hesitate. In 1960, he told his civil rights advisory staff that he was prepared to lose every state in the South at the Democratic Convention in order to preserve a strong civil rights plank in the platform. As Irving Bernstein, a very good historian from UCLA, between the 1960 election and his 1961 inauguration, President Kennedy asked his lead civil rights advisor, Harris Wohlford, to write a detailed memo on the entire issue. That plan, which was made up of legal actions and executive orders, was what Attorney General Bobby Kennedy followed once he was sworn in. In other words, what the show was selling at the beginning what Jones and Thomas are saying is no surprise, just wrong. All right. And in fact, in November of 1963, Bobby Kennedy was seriously pondering writing a letter of resignation to his brother because it had become obvious to him that his support for civil rights had been so prominent that he lost the entire South for his brother's 64 campaign, thus endangering his reelection. It's simply a historical fact. And I don't know why all these people try and deny it. In 3 years, less than 3 years, the Kennedy administration did more to advance the cause of civil rights than the previous 18 presidents did in the 100 years before them. And this culminated in JFK's memorable national address on the issue in June of 1963. The Kennedys chose that time to go on national television because the confrontations after Birmingham and at the University of Alabama, it was now possible to pass an omnibus civil rights bill over a filibuster in the Senate. That speech was originally penned, as the show tries to say that it was written by Bobby Kennedy, was actually written by his employee, Richard Yates, who would later go on to become a very famous novelist. He wrote that book, Revolutionary Road, that was then turned into a film. The treatment of the missile crisis is so elementary that I don't even think it would pass muster in a high school class. All right. It tries to say that Bobby Kennedy was the first person to suspect that somehow there had been missiles. That's just not true. John McCone, the director of the CIA, was the first person to suspect this. JFK had a hard time believing it because he had deliberately warned Khrushchev against putting offensive missiles into Cuba. All right. This is about 1 month before the U-2 flights captured the photos of the installations. All right. So finally, when the U-2 flights come in and he confronts the JFK confronts the Soviet foreign minister, and the Soviet foreign minister lies about it, okay, then the crisis is on. RFK now becomes important because of his back channel to Dobrynin. But it was really Khrushchev when he sent in his first telegram, his telex, formulating a deal about the missiles in Cuba for the missiles in Turkey. That was really the beginning of an answer to the problem. And it's interesting, of course, that during the one contribution of the show is that Jackie Kennedy never left the White House, which of course means that the whole Mimi Alford crap, okay, was a bunch of baloney, which I suspected for a long time. All right. And I can't believe so many people, even some people on our side, fell for it, which leads to the Marilyn Monroe angle. The film shows this famous clip of Monroe singing Happy Birthday to JFK at his 1962 birthday party. Whenever I see this clip, it always leaves out the information that, that wasn't like a private party or anything like that. That was at Madison Square Garden. Paid audience of 15,000 people. It was part of a Democratic Party fundraiser, something that JFK had done before. The reason there were 15,000 people there was because it included not just her, but Jack Benny, Danny Kaye, Ella Fitzgerald, Peggy Lee, Maria Callas, and Jimmy Durante, and even more. In other words, you had some of the most famous comedians and singers in the entire world there. That's why it was so crowded. All right. Now, this is one of the things I did a lot of work on in that previous essay. And I talked to some people who were authorities in the field. All right. And I came to the conclusion that this whole thing about Monroe and JFK was pretty much a rumor. There really wasn't anything there. And that people like Jeannie Carmen and Bob Schlatzer were really kind of clowns who furnished hack writers like David Heyman with tall tales to burnish their tawdry books with. All right, but these people never give up. And after I wrote that article, a man named John Miner held a press conference in Los Angeles and said that he had unearthed long buried audio tapes of Monroe talking about her relationship with JFK. I did some work on Miner. He had been in the LA District Attorney's office during the murder of Bobby Kennedy, during that case. He had been suspended for unethical practices for about 4 or 5 years. Now, having watched the LAPD and their, let's put it this way, not very zealous pursuit of justice in the Bobby Kennedy case, all right, I can tell you that that whole thing is institutionally wide, because at the civil suit of Scott Enyart against the LAPD for his pictures that he took in the pantry that night, the LAPD ran that trial, literally. And I put in details here of why I believe that is so. Bill Turner and John Christian, in their book, The Assassination of Robert Kennedy, revealed that the estate of the late William Joseph Bryan was executed by none other than John Miner. Now, to anybody who has studied the RFK murder, this is crucial to understanding the depths of official malfeasance in that case. For as people like Lisa Pease and Tim Tate have stated, Bryan is the prime suspect as the CIA Pentagon-associated psychiatrist who programmed Sirhan for his diversionary role in the RFK assassination. After Bryan died in a hotel room in Las Vegas, Miner sealed off Bryan's office and took possession of his personal and professional effects. After studying Bryan's career, I can state that there was a lot to hide. Miner was not taking any chances of any of it leaking out. Can one imagine anything much worse than a prosecutor in charge of the estate of a prime suspect in a murder case, one who got off scot-free? Finally, as William Blum writes in his book, The CIA Forgotten History, the LAPD cooperated with CIA agent Robert Mayhew in the production of a pornographic film depicting an actor as the Indonesian leader Sukarno with a shapely blonde woman who some have said resembled Monroe. Need I add that some knowledgeable people suspect Mayhew was involved in the RFK assassination? Anybody can connect the dots here. If you can fake a film, it's easy to create or alter audio tapes. And let me add this. Secret Service agents Clint Hill and Gerald Blaine are both on the record as saying that there was no such Marilyn Monroe liaison with JFK. And as anybody familiar with the Secret Service will understand, they had no great love for their boss. All right, now the film then goes into, well, let's put it this way. It completely ignores the steel crisis. JFK is standing up to the steel companies who double-crossed him in raising the price of steel, which the great John Blair, the economist, called, quote, the most dramatic confrontation in history between a president and a corporate management. All right? There's not one word in the whole series about that. There's almost nothing about the JFK assassination. Watching this show, you would think that the most tragic thing that happened was that since Jackie and JFK had lost a child, their marriage was, let's say, getting warmer. All right? That was about it. Nothing about all the changes that took place as a result of Kennedy's assassination in Congo, Indonesia, Vietnam. I can go on and on. None of that. And there's no record in this film of the reaction of Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev. when they got the news of Kennedy's assassination. We all know about that. It's because it's in JFK and the Unspeakable. All right. Castro was thunderstruck because JFK's emissary, John Daniel, was there. And JFK was mapping out a outline for rapprochement between the United States and Cuba. Castro was stunned. He said, "This is bad news," over and over. Then he got a second call telling him JFK was now dead. And Castro said, "Everything has now changed. Everything is going to change," which was true. When Khrushchev heard of the shooting, he went into a state of shock. The next day, when he signed his condolences at the American ambassador's residence, he appeared to be crying. As his biographer William Taubman wrote, Khrushchev needed Kennedy. And that was Kennedy's assassination, one of the things that led to Khrushchev being retired from office the following year. Neither Khrushchev nor Castro ever believed the official story as Oswald as a lone assassin. In fact, Castro made a speech the next day in which he went ahead and offered his opinion as to what really happened and why. None of this is in there. None of this. The avoidance syndrome continues to be apparent when we address Bobby Kennedy's reaction to the news of JFK's assassination. The program does deal with Hoover's calls to RFK's home, but it only skims the surface of all the phone calls that Bobby Kennedy made that afternoon. Like Castro, RFK immediately thought his brother had been killed as a result of a domestic plot. Okay, and his main suspects were the CIA, the Cuban exiles, and the mob, which of course shows how acute he was in that regard. All right, in other words, Bobby Kennedy was on the same page with Castro and Khrushchev. And then, of course, he and Jackie Kennedy sent William Walton, a cultural ambassador, to Russia to convey a message to Bobby's friend Georgy Bolshakov, all right, saying that they believed that Kennedy had been killed by a large domestic conspiracy. Lyndon Johnson would not be able to fulfill President Kennedy's grand design for détente since he was too close to big business interests. Bobby would then resign, run for office, and then run for the presidency. And then they would fulfill together JFK's goals of a détente and a melting of the Cold War. And again, this is in Tim Naftali's book, One Hell of a Gamble. So if they wanted to put it in there, they had the perfect guy to talk about it. All right? Now, what happens after, with Bobby Kennedy going to the Senate and then deciding to run for the presidency in 1968, they don't have anybody on this. Like Joe Palermo wrote a very good book on this in his own right. John Bohr wrote a pretty good book, The Revolution of Robert Kennedy. He's only on this show for like 3 minutes. Okay? They clearly didn't want to hear from these guys. What happened to Bobby Kennedy after his brother was assassinated? The conflict between, for example, Bobby Kennedy and LBJ over Vietnam, because Bobby Kennedy knew what his brother was doing that last year. All right? In other words, he was withdrawing. And so Bobby Kennedy opposed Johnson's escalation of the war. And then during 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, when Johnson invited the racist J. Edgar Hoover to the ceremony and offered him a pen and then gave the can of pens to Bobby Kennedy to pass out to everybody else, well, Bobby Kennedy got the message and he decided to resign from office, okay, and go to the Senate. There's nothing in the series about Bobby Kennedy standing up to the NRA. There's nothing about Senator Kennedy standing up to cigarette companies. There's nothing about his attempt to repeal right-to-work laws in the South, which weakened unions. You know, RFK's trip to Latin America is very much discounted. You know, John Bohr in his book Revolution of Robert Kennedy spends 24 pages on the things that Bobby Kennedy did down there. All right, which was like bawling out landlords for swindling their employees, um, trying to talk a crowd in Brazil to march on the presidential palace, going down into a mine to see what that job was like, and then coming up and say, hey, if I had to do that all day, I'd be a communist too. Mm. And if you can believe it, it doesn't do nothing, period, with which a lot of people believe is the whole highlight of Bobby Kennedy's tenure in the Senate, which was his trip to South Africa, to Cape Town in 1966, which I think was the first time any American politician had addressed the apartheid issue in a public forum. All right? Incredible. The chronicle of Bobby Kennedy's last campaign in 1968 is done without distinction of any kind at all. You know, and that's pretty bad, because that campaign for the Democratic nomination was really the last crusade of the generation of the 60s. It was their last hope after the murders of JFK, Malcolm X, and King. Now, King was still alive at the beginning, and he would not endorse LBJ or Eugene McCarthy. Okay? After they had cooperated through Marion Wright on the Poor People's Campaign, King was elated when Kennedy declared his candidacy, saying he would make an outstanding president. And of course, because Kennedy was associated at that time with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, which this series very much minimizes, he became the candidate for the poor and the downtrodden and minority groups. Well, within 3 weeks after his announcement, King was dead in Memphis. The program does show RFK going into downtown Indianapolis to calm a campaign crowd by delivering the news of King's death. But there's very little about the California primary, where for the first time in the history of the city of Los Angeles, the voter turnout on the poor east side was higher than the turnout on the wealthy west side. Because, of course, RFK was backed by Chavez, by Huerta, and by the memory of what he did for civil rights, all right, and his speech in Cape Town. He had given those people a reason to vote. Kennedy's campaign workers were shocked. They woke up early, and before the doors had even opened, on the voting booths in East LA, people were lined up for blocks. Okay? Mm. And that's, of course, what propelled him to his victory. All right? And there's almost nothing. Of course, we all know what happened. After he made his speech, he was assassinated in the pantry. All right? There's almost nothing about that assassination. Okay? And nothing about the impact of that assassination. Because the impact of that assassination, of course, was that it led to the victory of Richard Nixon, who was really kind of the anti-RFK. And it was Nixon and Kissinger who then continued the war in Indochina for 4 more years, and they expanded it into Cambodia and Laos. The Cambodian expansion caused the overthrow of Sihanouk, the leader of that country, which led to the coming to power of the Khmer Rouge, and a genocide that took the lives of 2 million more people. All right? Combined with the current surveys of how many perished in Vietnam from 1955 to 1973, that makes for a total of 6 million dead after the murder of JFK in Indochina. All right? Somehow CNN thought that Kennedy's falling out with Frank Sinatra over his underworld connections was more important than elucidating that fact of history. All right, and as I add here, that editorial choice tells us a lot about what our culture has devolved into. The segments on Eunice Shriver and Ted Kennedy they're almost too brief to even merit discussion. Eunice Kennedy married Sergeant Shriver, and they both became integral parts of the Kennedy administration and the Kennedy legacy. Joe Kennedy hired Sergeant Shriver to manage one of the crown jewels of his real estate empire, the Chicago Merchandise Mart. After JFK was elected, Shriver was one of the prime designers of the Peace Corps, then the Job Corps, and in the Head Start program. He ran the Office of Economic Opportunity under Johnson. He was then ambassador to France from 68 to 70. At his funeral in 2011, which I've linked to here, Bill Clinton said words to the effect that Sergeant Shriver set the bar too high for all those in public service. Eunice Kennedy, his wife, worked in the field of juvenile delinquency for the Justice Department. She then moved to Chicago to continue that work and also contributed her time to a women's shelter. She was a major advocate for special needs children and was very important in making the Special Olympics a national program. I mean, if there was ever a wealthy couple that did more for people in dire straits than the Shrivers, I'd like to know who it was. They don't get anything but lip service on this program. A small segment, comparatively speaking, is devoted to Ted Kennedy. Much of that, of course, is devoted to Chappaquiddick. And I think they get it all wrong. The best book I ever read on Chappaquiddick was a book by James Lang and Catherine DeWitt called Chappaquiddick, The Real Story. That book showed that, contrary to what the late Leo D'Amour was selling, Ted Kennedy didn't get any special treatment in that case. All right, it's pretty obvious that Ted Kennedy suffered a severe concussion in the accident. And this is why his doctors considered doing a spinal tap to see if there was brain damage. He also had to wear a neck brace for weeks afterwards. It was that concussion that caused his shock and retrograde amnesia. Kennedy got a suspended sentence for leaving the scene of an accident, and he, as an insurance company, paid an indemnity to the family of Mary Jo Kopechne for her accidental death. Mr. Lang, who was a very experienced personal injury lawyer, wrote that's pretty much what usually happened back in those days for a first-time case with a record as clean as Ted Kennedy's was. So now what Randy Tirabarelli, this entertainment reporter, says that Joan Kennedy, Ted's first wife, attended Mary's funeral with Ted, and this attendance was somehow directly related to a miscarriage in her pregnancy. What the show leaves out is that Joan Kennedy had previously suffered 2 prior miscarriages, that she had a mushrooming alcohol problem, for which she later received numerous traffic citations, and she had to go into rehab for. It was a problem that she could never really overcome. All right, it deals with the loss by Ted Kennedy to Jimmy Carter in the Democratic primaries in 1980. But it deals very little at all with his great moments in the Senate, his defeat of Robert Bork's nomination for the Supreme Court, his lonely, spirited defense of Anita Hill, his ultimate successful attempt to cut off funding for the Vietnam War, his attacks on Nixon and Kissinger for the genocide in East Pakistan, commonly called Bangladesh, his push for a settlement in Ulster, and his calling the Iraq invasion George W. Bush's Vietnam. All right? So, in other words, none of those specifics are really important, okay, to this show. This program is really the end result of a trend I first noticed in my 1997 essay in the assassinations, the posthumous assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's the combination of the tabloidization of our mainstream media with the desperate attempt by cable TV to garner a wider audience. That pairing has become fatal to honest reporting and scholarly research. In sum, this series is pretty much a worthless time filler. It ignored really good scholars on the Kennedy presidency, like Robert Rakove, and opted for People magazine types like Tara Borelli and Sally Bedell Smith, and mainstream hacks like Larry Ty and Evan Thomas. It's nice to see some female commentators on the program, but when they're as mediocre as the males, then what does it mean to have them on? What this program really proves is the opposite of what it tries to show. When you have to censor and curtail as much material as this series did, it reveals that the true facts of what the Kennedy brothers tried to achieve poses as much a national security problem for the country as the real facts about their assassination. But here's the capper, which I did not realize until later. And I added this as an addendum to the article. The main producer of the show was something called Raw TV, based in England. That production house was purchased by Discovery Channel in 2004. Discovery Channel, of course, was behind the late Gary Mack's attempts to reassert the discredited Warren Report with shows like Inside the Target Car and JFK, The Ruby Connection. I do not think it's a coincidence that the people who try and cover up the facts of the JFK murder are also those who disguise who he really was and what his presidency was all about. And at the end, I went ahead and I linked to my reviews of those two Discovery Channel debacles. Okay, and I also linked to my slideshow, which was done on the 100th anniversary of JFK's birthday. And it's a detailed examination of who JFK really was and what he really stood for. And I also linked to my essay at Consortium News about the real career of Bobby Kennedy. So you get an antidote to this mainstream garbage.
Yeah. So, so let me ask you. There's people are gonna watch this. Some of them know a lot about the Kennedys. Maybe some of them, probably 90% of them, know very little at all. You know, they'll watch it within a week. Maybe they'll probably forget most of the details, but they're gonna be left with this impression of the Kennedys. With like 1 minute, what is the impression that you think this leaves of the Kennedys? And why do you think, we know CNN is it faces pressures from politicians and just kind of general people, saying, "Oh, why present it like this?" Or even internally, why present it like this? No, let's present it like this. We have 6 hours to do it. We'll do it this way. We'll do it that way. We'll pick this, that. Why leave? Why leave that impression? As opposed to something more positive, especially in a time here where everybody's worried about the Trump and what's happening to democracy and all this kind of thing.
All right. I think that the motive behind a show like this and the fact that it was produced by Discovery Channel tells you a lot about the why. Is that it wants to downplay, discount, or in some cases completely ignore the great things that the Kennedys did. Like President Kennedy, RFK, and even Ted Kennedy to a lesser extent, in order to reduce their legacy. All right. And like I said at the end of my review, this goes hand in hand with what the mainstream media has done with the actual circumstances surrounding the assassinations of JFK and RFK. Because on the one hand, what you do is scream out time after time, there was no conspiracy. And on the other hand, if you say, well, they really didn't do all that much good stuff anyway, you essentially what that does, it stops any questioning about the why. And if you remember, one of the best scenes in Oliver Stone's movie JFK is when Mr. X is on the park bench with Jim Garrison, and he says, "That's the real question, isn't it? Why?" Okay, so one leads to the other. All right, and by the way, the MSM has been shameless in this regard, utterly shameless. And I have to say that the more I delve into this, because like I think I told you before, the last 5 years of my research career, I'd say I devoted about 80% of my time to uncovering the secret facts about President Kennedy's foreign policy. All right. And I didn't realize what a giant cover up there had been about that issue, you know. And I believe today, I believe that the cover up about what JFK was doing in the field of foreign policy, the really radical stuff he was doing, has been even more covered up than the real facts about his assassination. I realize that's a big statement, but I think I'm equipped to judge both because I've written books about both subjects. All right. And so I really believe that they go hand in hand, David. And I think that's the reason. It's not a coincidence the Discovery Channel that spent 2 shows covering up the circumstances of President Kennedy's murder is now in the business of covering up the true circumstances of his political career. I think they're both disgraceful, but unfortunately, and I've said this before also, in my estimation, the media in the United States is probably one of the very worst there is in all of the westernized countries. And it's getting better. Rather, not it's not getting better, it's actually getting worse.
Right.
All right, and the reason for that is that PBS has now gone into the tank on this issue.
But doesn't it behoove the Democrats to, I know they don't have control over CNN or anything like that, but doesn't it behoove them to enhance the legacy? We see how Ronald Reagan is treated as in this ridiculous way as this man who won the Cold War, and all his misdeeds and crimes that he carried out in Central America are completely ignored. And you almost see the opposite with Kennedy, where all of his failings are boosted and all of his successes are downplayed. But you don't really hear any complaints from Democrats or people on the left, which is a little more complicated, I understand. But doesn't it behoove them, or do you think that their policies now are just so far away from where Kennedy's was that they would rather forget about what he was trying to do?
Believe me, if there's anybody who would like to see that, it's me. Because I think this is one of the reasons the Democratic Party has become neutered, is because they don't stand up for the people they should be standing up for. In fact, as you can see from this program, people like Van Jones have ended up, in the pockets of the people trying to tear down that legacy. So nobody would like to see that more than I would. And the only time I think it's ever happened was when there was supposed to be that trashy series, that docudrama about the Kennedys, in which there was a Hollywood producer that began a campaign against it, and on the internet. And so it had to go to that trashy network Stars, which is getting more and more powerful as time goes on. At that time, it didn't reach out very many people, but now it does. And this, of course, is all related, David, to the terrible policies that were pursued by Bill Clinton that led to media conglomeration. That whole revision of the Telecommunications Act that Bill Clinton did I think it was 1996.
Right.
That was, oh my God. This began under Reagan, but it was then continued by the Clintons. And it's given us, first of all, it struck down the fairness doctrine and equal time. So this means, of course, that you can say just about anything you want to say on TV, and you don't have to grant the other side equal time. As we saw in 1967 or 68, when NBC attacked Jim Garrison on network television, he applied for equal time. And he although he didn't get equal time, he didn't get an hour. He did get 30 minutes. All right.
Oh, right.
But
And that's
see,
an incredible thing to watch. He gets to state
right.
his whole case on national TV. That must have been mind-boggling to see. Millions of people must have watched that.
See, but Reagan struck that down. All right. And disallowed for what we have today, which is advocacy television. You can attack anybody and you don't get equal time. And so then what Clinton did is he struck down the FCC rules about local monopolies and national monopolies. And that, which I think was in 1996, combined with what happened with the proliferation of cable TV that was coming in, that allowed the conglomeration of the, because NBC owns MSNBC, Fox Network owns Fox Cable, okay,
Right.
And CNN was run by Turner Network. So that allowed even these new technologies to now be dominated by these mega corporations. And so you don't have. And then, of course, when the Republicans began to have a Jeremiad against PBS, they began to strike more and more money away from the PBS budget. And so they had to go to private companies and foundations. And you go to foundation money, like most of the money's on the right. Okay, so you get people like the Cook brothers who sponsored that anti-JFK show that was on PBS for the 2013 anniversary. And this is what really worries me about the state of the media that we have. All right? And it's very, very unfortunate. Trump talks about fake news. All right? Well, unfortunately, he's not talking about the right fake news. He just does that in order to attack people who are attacking him. He really doesn't have very much interest in the whole historical saga of what has happened to the media in this country. It's an utter disgrace. If it wasn't for the internet, I really don't think we'd have much of anything. And as we know, Donald Trump is trying to hinder that with what will eventually become what they call the tiered system. In other words, if you want total access to the internet, everything, you're going to have to pay more than what you would if you got less and less. It's going to be like your options with cable TV.
Right.
If you want to only get basic cable, then you pay $35 a month. If you want to get the whole thing, it's $145 a month. That's where I think it will go unless the Democrats do something about this. Now, let me add one other point about this. We saw a few days ago a terrific historical upset. This little girl, Alexandria, I think her name is Ocasio-Cortez,
Right.
won, and actually she won very soundly. She won by about 12 points. She beat an entrenched Democratic congressman who was probably headed to become minority leader of the House of Representatives. She was outspent something like 6-1. And Crowley didn't underestimate her so much, he didn't even bother to debate her face to face. But she won on a very progressive platform. Okay? And this might be, now I'm not going to overstate this, but this might be, I believe, part of the reaction that's developing against Donald Trump. All right, I hope it is. This woman worked for Ted Kennedy. She actually worked in his immigration office. And she was the first person I know who in any kind of campaign began to actually say we should get rid of ICE. Okay, and if you can believe it, that's caught on now. Now there's about 7 or 8 Democrats who are talking about eliminating ICE, you know. So maybe that's a good harbinger. We'll see.
Right. Okay, let's...
David, you know something? Why don't we postpone the Tom Hanks one until a separate show? Because that actually deserves its own show.
Jim, this was a great talk. Thank you very much. And
yeah, thank you so much, David. And we'll take up Tom Hanks in 1968 on a second show.
Great, sounds good.
This is Our Hidden History